Good morning, and please open your Bibles to Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10. It's a wonderful blessing in my life to get to be with you today. Several years ago, my wife and I have been married for 42 years now, so it was longer ago than that I came up to Ohio and to her home in Ashland, just a little bit up the road. And so my wife has had me connected to Ohio ever since then. And one of the most idyllic moments in my life was our first Christmas as a married couple, and we were driving home to surprise my wife's parents up in Ashland. It was going to be their first empty nest Christmas, and we just couldn't bear the thought of that. So we were coming in Christmas Eve, and we came through Columbus, and as we were in Columbus, it started snowing. Frank Capra could not have done it better. It was just perfect, and so we sort of slid in on the snow up there, and but because of that, I've known of this church for many decades. And you have a wonderful name, and you do tremendous good, and I'm so thankful for you and so thankful to get to be here. It was great to see Greg's face last night when I walked out of the airport and know that I had a ride to the hotel. And it's been good working with Brandon, getting ready for the 12 questions, which has tremendous opportunity. I was reminded by the things Greg was saying at the very beginning about just using your social media connections to help publicize this thing. I'll tell you, one of the most foolish things I ever did in preaching is that when I was at the college church, I decided that I wanted to write a series of tracts. It's kind of old technology and everything, but I wanted to write something in the present tense, answering questions that people ask. And so I was going to do this all that semester, and I told the church that I was, on Sunday evenings, I would preach a sermon. It would be in tract form already printed up, and when they left, I would put it in their hands and for them to share with other people. And I got up and preached the first sermon and had not prepared a single tract. So I was committed to something, and I jumped in. And so every week for that semester, Monday was already a deadline. But one of the most fascinating things out of that was something old, something that's been around for probably hundreds of years, a way of doing something. But because we wrote these tracts and put them in people's hands, I had elders who would say, I'm sending these to my brother that I've talking to about the faith for the first time in decades, and people who would give them to folks at the job where they worked. And it just dawned on me as Greg was saying that about the connections, what an incredible opportunity to connect with our networks of friends as all the work has been put into this. And so I commend you for this, and I'm excited to be a part of it. I was asked to speak a few years ago at a lectureship on the subject of the Good Samaritan. And so I did what preachers always do on things like that, and you go back and you see, what did I do before, and what do my other sermons on this look like? At that time, I'd probably been preaching for about 20 years. I went back through my files, and what I found, and I was stunned by this, was that I had never preached a sermon on the Good Samaritan. I had mentioned the Good Samaritan many, many times, but I never had just taken the Good Samaritan and made a sermon of that. And so I'd like for us today to turn our attention to this probably most famous story in all of the Bible, and a story that a lot of people in America today know and don't even know it's from the Bible. But for you and me to turn our attention to the parable of the Good Samaritan. And behold, beginning with verse 5, behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? And Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. And he went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And he said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, you go and do likewise. There we go. I was told Greg messes this up every week, so I was just trying to be in the tradition of the church here. So, do you have a folder for that? So, the story is one of those stories that is so easily accessible. Everybody knows it. Even young children can tell you the story. And yet it's remarkable because even though the details are so simple and we can grasp it in some ways so easily, we never can quite get our arms around it, can we? There's always a little bit something more there that it's calling us to than we can ever fully feel like we have mastered. The story is very straightforward. Jericho is 17 miles east-northeast of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is at 2,500 feet in elevation. In those 17 miles going to Jericho, we go to 700 feet below sea level. So you're dropping off very, very quickly. It is a desolate area even to this day. I've been on a tour bus before, driving that road and feeling like we're out here in the middle of nowhere. Well, this man is out there and he's alone. And robbers fall on him and they beat him up and they strip him and they leave him for dead. He's robbed. It's just the worst day of his life. And so he's there when a priest comes walking by. He's been to Jerusalem. He's been working at the temple for his period of time, and now he's headed home. And he walks by, and when he sees this, he walks by on the other side. And we scratch our heads and we wonder, we don't know why, but we wonder why it was he did this. And you and I think, well, maybe he was afraid that he could easily be attacked by robbers just like this man was. Maybe it was just too much of a bother. Maybe this man was in a hurry to get home. Maybe he was afraid the man was dead and he didn't want to become unclean. We don't know why it was, but he walked by on the other side. A little later, there's a Levite who comes by and does the exact same thing. He too had been doing some service in the temple, and he was walking home, and as he's headed home, he sees this, and he walks by on the other side of the road. And Jesus tells the story then of this Samaritan, someone who is a part of a race of people that the Jews had nothing to do with. In John 4, Jesus says that the Jews had no dealings with the Samaritans. Or another way that John is saying it is that the Jews don't even use the utensils that the Samaritans use. And so they are a despised people who live in their proximity. And there is a Samaritan who comes along. And he stops and he binds up the man's wounds, and he pours on oil and wine, and he puts him on his animal, and he takes him to the inn, and he pays for his care. And it's a marvelous, marvelous story. Why is it that it has such a hold on us? Why is it that this story lives in our hearts? I think part of it is that we easily see ourselves in the story. That all of us see ourselves, I think, at times as the person who has been beaten and robbed. We all have those times in our lives where we are saying, somebody help me. That it's something that has gone terribly wrong or terribly tough in our lives, and we've cried out. We've cried out to God, somebody please help me. And all of us can identify with that priest and that Levite because you and I know what it's like to be presented with an opportunity to help someone, and we're afraid, or we're too busy, or for whatever reason we just don't do it. And we know when that happens, we know that we missed an opportunity. And when we read this story, we can identify with the priest and the Levite. And we can identify with the Good Samaritan. Those are the best moments in our lives, aren't they? God presents us with an opportunity to help someone, and we step into that space and we sacrifice time. Maybe we sacrifice money. We get our hands dirty and we help someone. And at times like that, don't we feel closer to God maybe than at any other time? We feel like we are walking in the steps of Jesus. We feel like we are doing exactly what the Lord would have us do. We find ourselves in the story somewhere. I have a very dear friend that for about 25 years we had breakfast every Tuesday morning together. And he was telling me once that he on Sundays has his extended family come to their dinner table. And he said that they always talk about what went on in Bible class. And he was asking a preschool granddaughter and said, what did you study about in Sunday school today? And she said, we talked about the man who got hurt. And he knew that we were talking about the Good Samaritan. And so being a good grandfather, he tries to draw her out and see what she learned and all of this. And he says, and who was the hero of that story? And he said she had these big eyes and she was so excited to tell him who was the hero of the story. And she said, the donkey. So maybe we even see ourselves there, you know. If I can help in some way, Lord, let me be that Good Samaritan. There is something that's important, I think, as we launch into this today. Fred Craddock, a writer in the field of preaching, has made the statement that there's a danger when we preach stories that everybody's familiar with. He said, we can boil off all the water and preach the stain at the bottom of the cup. A preacher can spend the week with a text like this and come to the pulpit and say, today there are 3 things I want to tell you about the Good Samaritan. Well, we're not going to master this story today. We're not going to preach the stain at the bottom of the cup. And hopefully when you walk out of here today, the thing that lives in your heart is not anything even that I've said, but hopefully it's the story itself. And hopefully you've come to see it as sort of like a beautiful gem that you hold up to the light, and every time you turn it just slightly, you see colors there that you never saw before. There's something here for everyone today, and something for us every day. This is all set up by the encounter with this man, this teacher of the law. And this man does not appear to be a sincere, humble God seeker. The text says that in verse 25, he came to Jesus with his question, and he said it was a test. He is testing the Savior, trying to trip him up in some way. Later it says, as he had been told that what you've said is right, and he then tries to justify himself. He's trying to protect himself in some way. And so he asked Jesus, so love your neighbor as yourself. Well, who is my neighbor? And at the end of the story, when Jesus asked the question, after telling the story of the priest and the Levite and the Good Samaritan, that Jesus says, and which one proved to be a neighbor? Which one was the good neighbor? And this man can't even bring himself to say Samaritan. Notice that in the text. You don't see the word Samaritan. What you see instead is the one who showed him mercy. So there's absolutely nothing about this man that we really admire. And Jesus stands up and speaks magnificently to him. Let me go backwards. There we go. Jesus speaks magnificently to him. There's something that you see all through the Gospels where Jesus is asked a question and Jesus knows it's the wrong question. And so when Jesus is confronted with the wrong question, what he typically does is not answer it. Because Jesus always understood and realized that the right answer to the wrong question can still leave us in the wrong place. The right answer to the wrong question can still leave us in the wrong place. So Jesus is asked, so who is my neighbor? And this man is trying to justify himself. He's trying to protect himself. He's trying to limit the demands of this. He's been told, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, how many folks are my neighbor? How far do I have to reach out? Can I be justified in being a neighbor to these folks, but not to those folks? It's been said that because this man was a lawyer who came to Jesus, said that, in all likelihood, there was something like this. Frederick Buechner, in his book Wishful Thinking, said what he probably was expecting was an answer something like this. Who is my neighbor? Jesus. Well, a neighbor, hereinafter referred to as the party of the first part, is to be construed as meaning a person of Jewish descent whose legal residence is within a radius of no more than 3 statute miles from one's own legal residence, unless there is another person of Jewish descent, hereinafter referred to as the party of the second part, living closer to the party of the first part than one is oneself, in which case the party of the second part is to be construed as neighbor to the party of the first part, and one is oneself, relieved of all responsibility of any sort or kind whatsoever. I don't know if that's what he was thinking or not, but that's the general spirit. Who is my neighbor? Jesus, draw the circle a little smaller. Make it a little more limiting. Let me off the hook for a whole lot of people. Grieven, in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, makes this statement, and he's so spot on. He says, one cannot define one's neighbor. One can only be a neighbor. Or Darrell Bach, in his commentary on Luke, says, neighbors can come from surprising places. Neighbors can come from surprising places. And I think we could add to that, and things like virtue or faith or kingdom heroes can come from all kinds of places as well. When I think about preaching on the Good Samaritan, there's a moment I wish I could recreate. I can't, because you know the story. You've cheated. You got there ahead of me. But there's a moment I wish I could recreate. It's the moment where Jesus says, but then a Samaritan. And if I could recreate that in this building this morning, what would happen would be, when I said Samaritan, there would be an audible gasp all over this auditorium. Everyone would, because that was unexpected and it was shocking. I want to tell you about a Good Samaritan moment in my life. One January, I'd been up to Washington, D.C. for a conference, and one of the people who spoke there was the head of the public relations department at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta. And they had just been in a firestorm, a PR firestorm, because of the Ebola doctors in Liberia. And Kent Brantley, one of the Ebola doctors who was one of Time's People of the Year that year. They were on the cover of Time magazine. He had contracted Ebola and was being brought back to the States to Emory University Hospital. The PR people at Emory University Hospital said it was a nightmare, that media, the national media and especially social media, just unloaded on Emory University Hospital. Because what are you doing bringing him back here? And what most people didn't realize is that there's a whole network of hospitals that have full dress rehearsals for just such a thing all the time. And Emory University Hospital was one of those. So they were bringing Kent Brantley back, and there were people on social media saying, he's a missionary. He went over there knowing what he was doing. He deserves to die. If he dies, he dies. And that went on for a couple of weeks. And the guy said, when the PR department, he said, we were helpless. All we could do was put out good information. But when we put out good information, it was just sort of blown away. But we just kept saying, here, we're speaking truth into this situation. And he said that day up in D.C., he said, it took about 2 to 3 weeks for our better angels to appear. And people started saying, no, that's not who we are. And we want this man to be healed. Well, I'd heard that presentation, and it was riveting. And it was about 3 weeks later that we had Kent Brantley speak on campus. And he told us his story, and he walked us through it. He had gone with Samaritan's Purse to Liberia because of an Ebola outbreak. And they were doing everything they could to stop the outbreak right there. And it was feared at one time that it might be a worldwide pandemic. The local hospital and health people in Searcy, Arkansas were table-topping this and talking about what are we going to do when Ebola gets to Searcy. Well, this is something that the world is terrified of. Kent Brantley goes and he's on the front lines. He told us of how the hospital he worked in Liberia had 2 wings, and on one wing it was about Ebola, and the people dressed up in those hazmat suits. And they looked like, they were spacewalking or something. And he worked, he said they were using all the precautions that you would use in an American hospital at that time. And then there was another wing of the hospital that's where they just continued to do the stuff of life as people are dealing with all kinds of illnesses. He told of how he had spent a night on the regular side of the hospital trying to save the lives of 2 young women who were delivering their children and having terrible difficulties with it, and worked all night long with a team of doctors and nurses. And in the morning hours, they lost both mothers and both children. It had just been a horrible, horrible night. And he said that's the night he thinks he got Ebola. He said it wasn't in the Ebola wing. It was someone who came in the other wing with Ebola. When he got it, it ravaged his body immediately. All energy was gone. In a matter of just a couple of days, the nurses he had worked with were having to diaper him. He told us that night as he stood before us, he told us about when they brought the phone to him to call his parents and his siblings. And he said they all wept because they knew this wasn't just a touching base call. This is the last time you'll hear my voice. There was no cure. They knew this was the end. He told about how he got transfusions 3 days in a row. The first day it was from the blood bank in the hospital. The second day he got a blood transfusion from one of his coworkers there. The third day, there was a 14-year-old Liberian boy, and he had Ebola, and was one of the few people in the whole world that had ever heard of who had had Ebola and who had lived through it. And he wanted to give his blood to this missionary doctor. And his parents wanted him to give his blood to this missionary doctor. And as he's telling us this story about this family and this third blood transfusion and about their coming to the hospital and giving him his blood, and he said, and he was a Muslim. And when he said that, I remember thinking it was like somebody had hit me in the chest. And I remember thinking, sitting there that night, this must be what it was like when the first hearers heard Jesus tell this story. And he said, and then a Samaritan. Because there was something noble and there was something positive. It's not saying that everything about this Samaritan was good, but it's saying that there was virtue there that so many people in the world did not see because they had written off all Samaritans. When my wife and I made the change in our lives, and I went from preaching for 14 years at the college church. And I went across the street to work at Harding University. I always described it as I walked across the street, worked with the same people on a different planet. And that's what it was like walking into higher education. But the summer in between those two things, we spent the summer in Greece. And we were faculty at Harding University in Greece program. And I taught a Bible class and a communications class. My wife taught a PE class, and she taught a class called Ed Fed, Foundations of Education. And she had tutored with some of the teachers there on the main campus and had gone over with their notes, and she was teaching the class. And every night before she taught the class, I was her first student. And so she would teach me what she was going to be teaching the next day. I still believe Harding University owes me 3 hours of credit for educational foundations. I have taken that class. I was tutored in that class. One of the theories that she shared in teaching with me was, she said I was taught that good teachers are in the business of putting folders in the hands of their students. That you have a new idea, it's a new folder. It may be that it's debits and credits in accounting. It may be that it's the subjunctive in English. It may be that it's the Pythagorean theorem. It could be any of a number of ideas, but once a good teacher has taught you something, what they've done is they've given you a folder. And then from then on in life, you recognize things. You realize, I heard that before, and you put that information here. If you don't have a folder, that information falls to the ground and does you no good. But if you have a folder, it goes inside of this. And I think one of the root problems for so much bias and bigotry and hatred is that we don't have enough folders in our lives for people who have something to teach us. I believe that Jesus is doing this in the Gospel of Luke. All throughout the Gospel of Luke, we find people who show us something virtuous in the most unlikely of places and the most unlikely people. Mary, the mother of Jesus, an unwed peasant girl, and yet she is the one who says, "Behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word." Or Levi, someone who would have been totally written off by most Jews of his day. Jews who had made themselves Gentiles is how tax collectors were spoken of. And yet, when Jesus calls him and says, "Follow me," he left everything and he rose and he followed him. We didn't expect to see that there. In Luke chapter 7, there's a centurion. He's a Gentile soldier in an occupation army, easily despised. And he asked Jesus to come and heal his servant who was at the point of death. And when Jesus is not far from his house, the man sends to Jesus and says, "Oh, don't come to my house. I know that being a Jewish teacher, you can't do that, but I understand authority. You just say the word and my servant will be healed." And when Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turning to the crowd and followed him and said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." A sinful woman with the alabaster vial of ointment, known as the sinful woman. But Jesus, at the end of the story, says to the people around him, "I tell you that her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much." A woman with a 12-year issue of blood, perpetually unclean. And Jesus says to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Jesus is giving the people new files. Luke chapter 17, 10 lepers are healed. And there is one who turns around and comes back. And remember, he was a Samaritan. And he comes back. And Jesus asks where the others are. And then Jesus says to him, "Rise and go your way. Your faith has made you well." Luke chapter 19, we run into Zacchaeus, certainly the most hated man in Jericho. And we find that when Jesus comes to his house, this man says, "Half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone, I'll pay back 4 times." The centurion on the cross, who Jesus gives the opportunity to say the best line in all of the gospel, certainly this was an innocent man. In the book of Acts, "And you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the world." There is a lot of spiritual blindness in the world because we simply don't have a folder for that. As I pull this together, I take some folders with me. And maybe you need one. And maybe you find that you don't have one for good men. And there are some people, both men and women, who don't have a file for that, or a file for good women. Good white people. Good black people. Good brown people. In this season, good politicians. Good poor people. Good rich people. Good immigrants. Good vaccinated people. Good unvaccinated people. The next two, everybody needs one of these next two. Good Republicans or good Democrats. Good Ohio State Buckeye fans. Can you even say it? Can you even say it? We're not faithful to the Word of God if we don't say it. Good Michigan fans. I married into this tribe. I told you, I understand that. Do you have a file for that? Jesus told a story one day, surprised everybody by who the hero of the story was. And he challenges us. He challenges us as he tells the story of someone who was a neighbor that you never would expect to be a neighbor. And then he says, go and do likewise. And that's the call to the church here today. Go and do likewise. We extend the invitation this morning to come to this Jesus, this Savior who is so magnetic and so attractive, and we want to be like him in every way. And this morning, if you are ready to put your confidence in him, walk away from sin and to walk in his footsteps, if you are ready to confess him as Lord and be baptized into Christ this morning, we would love to share that experience with you. If you have some burden that you need to bring before the congregation, I have enough confidence in this church to say they'll walk with you and they'll care for you, and they'll bind up your wounds and pour on oil and wine on your heart. If in any way this morning you're subject to the invitation of Jesus, let's hear the words of the Lord. Go and do likewise, as we stand and sing.